Okay, I think we have everyone here. Let's go ahead and get started. We'll call the Johnston City Council work session number 26-16 order. Cindy, roll call, please.
Councilmember Cope.
Here.
Evans.
Here.
Martin.
Here.
Redding.
Here.
Burkhart.
Here.
We have one agenda item this evening, and that is an overview and impact of Senate Law 2472. Mike?
Thank you, Mayor and Council. As I think all of you, each and every one of you are aware, this past legislative session, the Iowa legislature, ultimately signed by Governor Reynolds, had proposed Senate File 2472, which is now law, that is the most significant structural change to the property tax system in 2 decades. Historically, the United States property taxes was really based on as values of properties went up, revenue would go up a similar percent, or at least the ability to raise revenue would go up a similar percentage. This legislation really changes that whole approach, because that's no longer really the approach. So going forward, growth of existing property values does not necessarily mean that's how much your property values or your property taxes will go up, but rather there is a hard 2% cap based on existing values that this will be subject to annually going forward. There's different components like debt service, employee benefits that are above those caps or exempt from the 2% cap, but our largest being the general fund will be subject to that cap. Certainly, as we talk through this, if you have questions, please pop in and ask any questions. I would say as a disclaimer, there's a lot of assumptions built into this. We are working through trying to understand this legislation and we get additional guidance from our department management and legal counsel that will change some of our assumptions that are in here. Additionally, there are certain value information that's in this presentation tonight that will change as we get the final and official valuations from the county, which will occur in late 2026, early 2027. So please realize that this is best estimates as we go forward. This first part is really just kind of the legislation. I'm going to really go through this. If you have questions, certainly ask. But an overview of the bill, it was approved by the House and Senate by wide margins, was signed by the governor. There are 26 different divisions of this legislation, really about property assessment, rates, credits, exemptions, general fund appropriations, budget process, and other components. It does affect counties, schools, cities. I'm only going to focus on 7 of the divisions today that really are more particular for cities. Division 2 is the 2% revenue increase limitation. This only affects our combined general fund levy, so our 810 today, 788. It applies to the existing taxable valuation plus any revaluation. Does not apply to new construction. We'll talk about that and have some examples. So the caps for fiscal year 28 to 2030 is equal to a levy rate of 1,000 divided by 1,000. Then the value equals to 102% of the current actual property tax collected in the current fiscal year. What that does in a nutshell is it does allow for the period of 2028 through 2030 for the general fund to actually have a levy rate higher than 810. But then starting in fiscal year 2031, the 810 resumes. Net growth or new growth is not subject to the 2% cap. And that or new growth is considered new construction, additions, improvements to existing structures, and boundary adjustments or what we know as annexations. New growth does not include properties rolling out of TIF district or properties no longer receiving tax abatement. Division 3 is use of bonds for indebtedness. Does prohibit bond proceeds to be used for general operations, which we currently do not do. It does allow direct and indirect capital expenditures like engineering costs and inspections to be applied or paid out of debt proceeds. It also allows capital leases, which is again one of those areas we use. So it's really not impactful to the city. Division 8 is property classification and assessments. For the most part, there was no changes to the existing rollback system and ones in place for most property classifications. It does reestablish the multi-residential property classification. So if you recall back in the day, multi-residential was at the same rate as commercial. And that was phased out over another number of years. 2 years ago, it was finally phased out, and then the actual classification was eliminated. This brings back that classification, and then starting in FY '29 is the residential rollback plus 3%, and then FY 2030 and beyond, it is rollback plus 6%. Now, as those come on, the reality is that does not create, again, if you recall earlier in the presentation, I talked about property value does not necessarily equate to getting more property dollars, and that 2% cap still applies. So having more property value in 29 and 30, all it is going to do is redistribute the tax burden and actually lower the levy rate itself. But it does not allow the city to capture more property tax revenue. Division 11 is the general fund reserves. Does sign that unassigned reserves cannot be more than 35% of the prior year expenditure. But there's kind of a two-part test. First of all, during the budget, we have to have that. We have to meet that threshold, which our policy today is 25%, so we should meet that. But then at the end of the fiscal year, we also need to meet that requirement of that 35% reserve. We typically we have been for decade plus exceed that 35% at the end of the fiscal year. And so one way around that is to obligate the funds for specific projects. So for example, one way we could obligate funds is for fiscal year 2026, we had planned to do a housing study. We did not undertake that housing study, so we could have obligated those funds in the future to do that housing study to remain under that cap. Division 13 is really about urban renewal. What I would say about urban renewal and the overall urban renewal laws, if this was the only part of the legislation that was approved, the reality is I think urban renewal was a pretty good change for cities. A little bit, some cities would be upset, certainly didn't have access to perpetual changes. But new TIF districts created after 1/1/27 are limited to 23 years, which is an increase that we currently have, except if you had some right, those would be able to be perpetual, so that would be an impact there. But those are very few and far between, certainly for Johnston. Creating a new slum light would probably be difficult. One of the things it does create limitations for perpetual TIF, or those TIFs that are not subject to a sunset. It does say after 20 years, cities can only collect about 60%, or can only collect 60% of the available increment in the district, and the rest of it has to be released to the other taxing authorities. For the city of Johnston, our East Central will be one of the perpetual TIFs we have today. Today we collect about 75% of that district. So we do not collect 100%, so we're actually in a good position that when we get 20 years out, we'll be able to meet that quite likely. As we plan future debt issuances, we'll keep that in mind. Other changes for urban renewal, it does exclude the school foundation levy from capture after new TIF districts collected is 1/1/27. This was hard work by the mayor and some of the legislative outreach we did, and this was very important to the bylaw. So this was a change that was made in the legislation to go from 1/1/26 to the 1/1/27 date, so that was very important to us. This does not impact existing TIF districts that were created prior to 1/1/27. Now, for new TIF districts for the city of Johnston, this will result in a decrease of 22.6% to the available increment towards projects with rebates, but also projects that we would do in an urban renewal district that are public projects. So you think about 62nd Street, the project we're doing there, we're using East Central dollars for that. The Rural Hay Road Overlay project. In the future, if it was not an urban renewal district, we receive 22.6% less revenue for that type of project.
Okay. So it doesn't impact an existing TIF district?
Correct. So like I said, we didn't have these or the essential urban renewal in place, that would impact it, but it does not for those projects.
So it isn't project specific, it's an existing district.
It's not project, it's just as long as the urban renewal was in place prior to that date. So as we amend urban renewal plans, we can make changes to the plans, we just cannot have a new TIF ordinance go in place. The TIF ordinance is the triggering factor.
And so, and it says it will reduce TIF revenue on new TIF districts that are created after 1/1/27,
Correct.
22.6%. So if a new TIF district is created prior to 1/1/27.
Does not impact.
Tom.
I would note the legislation did have a component for schools to opt in to this. I think it would be a very difficult thing if you understand school funding. School funding is really subject to per pupil, and so if you receive less school foundation money and the state's not going to actually, the school will get less dollars to. It has to be a really special project.
Is your mic?
The last thing I would like to point out in the urban renewal is it does recognize workforce housing as economic development. So it does give more flexibility than that. Today, we do not have any residential urban renewal periods today, so it's not impactful to us. It also removes the low to moderate income set-aside requirement. This is a requirement that in urban renewals, you have to set aside a percentage of low to moderate income persons in your county to a special fund to designate your projects for RMI population to do projects to support them. That was actually very difficult for most cities to meet and to spend those funds. So a lot of cities have a lot of RMI money that's just sitting there. That's a requirement now that we're removed from statute. Homestead credits and exemption. While 2% will be an ongoing thing, this is the area that will really impact us as we go into FY 2028. So the homestead credits, which is state credit today and in place, that is going to be ending at the end of the current fiscal year on June 30th, 2027, and is replaced with a new homestead exemption. The homestead exemption is 10% of the taxable value. A taxable value of a home is whatever your assessed value multiplied by the rollback. That is your taxable value, and then it's 10% of that with a minimum of $5,500 and a maximum payout of $20,000 per home. Unlike the homestead credit, this new exemption is not taxable or paid for by the state of Iowa. So this will cause in year one a substantial decrease in overall property, taxable property values for the city of Johnston, about $90 million is what we're estimating. The current homestead credit will be phased out over a 3-year period. So we'll receive 2/3 of that credit in FY 28 based on our FY 27 dollars received, and then 1/3 in FY 29 and no credit in FY 30. So really minor part of our budget overall. The exemption by far outweighs what the credit would, what we receive from credit. And again, the exemption is not state funded and will reduce our overall taxable base. I'll show that in examples coming up. It does maintain the homestead exemption for the elderly population of $6,500 per household, and the new homestead exemption will be adjusted according to the consumer price index beginning fiscal year 2029. And then the business property tax credit remaining for the state actual will be eliminated beginning on July 1, 2027.
Mike, can you pause for just a second? I don't want to hold you up too much. Is the elderly homestead exemption in addition to that 20,000?
Yes.
And then the second question is, will CPI be applied, or that CPI adjustment be applied yearly or every 2 years to match valuation? Did you say that?
Annually.
Annually.
So, yes, we'll still have the revaluation happening every 2 years. And it will add a more complicated component like the rollback, so you end up with this probably a more pronounced yo-yo. So if you think about last year was a revaluation year, so that tends to push the rollback down. And when that rollback goes down, it lowers the burden on your residential property taxpayers, but it increases the burden onto our commercial taxpayers. This will, because of the homestead credit exemption, on just the residential, it will make that more pronounced on a non-revaluation. So we'll see how it plays out over time. It will be another component. And I think that's a really important point to hit on as we talk about this bill. One of the things this bill did was add more complexity to the overall property tax bill. Stuff like the rollback is still in place, stuff like House File 718 and growth limitations and the haircuts, that is all still in place. So there's a lot of things we have to really watch as we move forward with this legislation. Just one more complexity.
Thank you.
And interesting on that note, the Legislative Service Bureau, when they put together their fiscal note, which actually came out in July, noted that there's a lot of complexity. Property tax is complex. And when they went through every division, they said, these different divisions, if there's interplay between the divisions, well, we can't calculate or estimate what those interplays are, so they only look at each division in a silo, even though they admit that there's interplay between those divisions. The last division I'm going to highlight is Division 21. This is the local government budget statements. This is a real nice change from what we have today, where a generic property tax form goes out on hypothetical property that is state mandated on what the values are. This is now going to require a parcel-specific statement based on the various proposed property tax levies that the city, county, and school puts together. It will be parcel-specific. This does allow it to either be posted just online or for the county to mail it. And forms have to be developed in conjunction with the Department of Management, the League of Cities, and the Iowa State Association of Counties. Okay, we made that in good time, so I feel a little over at. Fiscal impacts, and this I just want to walk through and really talk about how does this legislation overall impact cities. For FY 2028, a 2% increase in the general fund plus new construction, we're estimating right now to generate $530,000 in new property tax revenue for the city. Expenses for FY 2028, and again, we can play with these numbers, we can move levers in here, but if we look at what are expenses attributed to contract wage increases for union employees, I would have an asterisk in there to say our fire is not settled, but our police and asterisk would be, so we do have contractual requirements we need to make. Our non-union wage increases based on its current city policy, a 3% increase in non-employee expenses, which is, I would say, admittedly on the lower side of what we're seeing in some of our commodities and services that we rely on. And then 2 new police officers. We're projecting there's a $1.2 million increase in those expenditures. So just at a high level, as we look at this, expenses are projected to exceed revenue by about $693,000. And so that's kind of the high level as we walk through it in here.
Hey, Mike, I'm sorry, can you go back?
Yep.
So, into your expenses, your 1.224 million, so, and you include a list there, but let's say, for instance, we have a software program that we use, and it's a subscription-based type software, and did you build any costs in for any of that type of stuff in here?
Well, it would be a 3% increase for non-employee expenses.
Okay. So you're just presuming everything's at 3%, I mean, which I think is probably so you built something in there for
We
those.
built something in there, admittedly, it's probably not. Like our financial system, Tyler, that's a bill that runs probably about $80,000 to $90,000. Last year went up about 5%. So, there are some contractual costs that we simply don't have any control over. And so 3% is a modest increase in may not be paid off. So some of that's going to have to be tempered to figure out how do we keep that overall pool of costs down to that 3%.
Mike, I just want to make sure that I understand this slide. This slide assumes that we are going to agree to a 2% increase to get that cap.
Correct. This would be us.
Well, we don't have a cap next year, but.
If this would assume that we go to the one-time cap. Now, there's other levers the city certainly could entertain. What I'm hearing from most cities is they're all going to get to that 2% cap. The reality is, do they
Repeat that sentence.
Most of
Like
my,
some,
most of the cities, all the cities I've talked to, are gonna hit the 2% cap, some way or another. Now, they may move money between levies, but they're all going to get to 2%, even if that requires the general fund to increase the levy.
But this assumes we take it to the 2%.
Correct.
And again, it assumes the projection is correct at $1.2 million. So we're saying that if we go to the 2% cap, then we're still short $692,000.
Correct. So I kind of started with the bottom line first.
I mean, and this assumes no identification of savings or reduction in spending, or this is just based on status quo spending from this year, plus all of the built-ins, and adding on 2%.
Well, it's adding on contractual obligations for wages, a 2% or 3% on non-staff costs, and 2 police officers, balanced with just 2% increase in our general fund.
Again, the point that I'm trying to make is this does not assume any hard look at the dollars that are being spent for reductions in spending.
And certainly, we're gonna have to do a hard look, knowing we're gonna have a gap of $692,000. There's gonna, the staff is already working on that to identify how do we make those reductions. And $693,000, is 2.6% reduction in overall expenditures based on today's revenues. Any other questions?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if you don't do a hard look at cutting spending, you're gonna somehow, your expenses will exceed your revenue by $693,000, which I'm not sure we're allowed to do.
And I'm not suggesting you do that.
Right. So by definition, you're going to have to have a hard look at your spending.
Yeah.
So,
I just want to make it clear to the council that at this point, I'm not ready to say that we should build in the 2%.
you're right. I mean, I think obviously the first thing we should do is figure out, can we cut spending by $693,000? Maybe we can get spending by $800,000. Don't know. Maybe we can.
Right. We're thinking the same here. We got to start with where it's safe.
Sure. Right. That's your first step. Right. But I don't think, I'm not hearing that there isn't going to be an effort made to look for savings.
Yeah, and we'll talk about, I have some slides later that will talk about some of the work we're doing as staff to try to identify those savings. Okay, let's move on. So this first is just a look at the general fund. So I'm zooming into the general fund. So this is our actual FY 2027 general fund. Our taxable valuation is $1.9 billion. We have a tax levy rate of 788. And so when you multiply that through, that generated $15.1 million in property taxes. So as we look at this new legislation, you still have your taxable valuation, but we take out new growth. We actually bring new growth back in down here, so it comes out, but it comes back in. We introduce the homestead exemption, we come up with a new tax valuation. We take that rate to come up with property tax collected, we bring in property taxes that new growth collects, and we get an actual property tax collected and change. So as we look at that, if we hold the levy rate flat, so if we hold the 788 where it's at, and what's on the screen, I think does a good job of helping us walk through it. Again, we're projecting $1.94 billion in value. This is with help from EFM. As we then take out the new growth and we have the homestead exemption, we take out $90 million of value. We end up with $1.82 billion in value. But you can see that is almost $90 billion below what our FY 27 value was. So that's the impact of the homestead exemption. So now you multiply that, it's $14.4 million in property tax collected. The new growth brings in $222,000. And so our actual property tax collected is $14.6 million, or 3.1% less than the $15.1 million we collected in FY27. So that becomes, if that would be an option the council would select, that $14.6 million becomes your new base as you look at going into fiscal year 29. So I think one question we look at is, well, what if we hold property tax collections flat? It's really a math problem at that point, because the first four variables are exactly the same, they don't change. Your property rate, your tax rate would have to go to 8.13, that would collect 14.88 million in property taxes. It would raise 229,000 on new construction for a total of 15.1 to come up with no change. Then our 2% increase brings in $15.4 million. So that's 2% above what you collected in FY27. So that's where that number comes in. Again, the first four variables are the same, there's no change there. So the levy rate would have to go to $8.43. And then our new growth taxes would be $237,000 for 15.66 million, or a 3.57 increase. And the reason it's more than 2% because new growth is on top of the 2%, and that's how that growth happens. What I would tell you is every city that I've talked to is trying to figure out how to get to here, because again, that 2% really is not going to keep up with what the cost of providing services are. Now, how cities are trying to manage this and not have a levy rate increase so dramatically is when they have tax increment financing and they have increment they can release, the question was, do we release them? So one of our options, again, if we have that $15.4 million is 2% taxes to collect, we were planning to release, based on what we were doing with PFM, $73 million in TIF revenue. And so if we release that, our tax valuation actually goes to just over $2 billion. The next two variables stay the same, so they don't change between the model. So our total taxable value is $1.9 billion, and so our levy rate would be 811, and our overall new growth taxes would be 228,000 for 15.6 million, or 3.51%. So, if the assumption is we're going to allow 2% increase in the general fund, my recommendation would be to do a TIF release to manage the overall levy rate. Still, it is an increase in the overall levy rate, but it is more manageable.
So Mike, what do we actually gain in dollars by the release of the TIF?
We actually lose a little bit of dollars because the levy rate, when you release a TIF, all it does is push down the levy rate. And so we lose, we don't have any change in actual property taxes collected for the existing value, because again, we're capped at 2% of the existing value. All it does is lower the overall levy rate. We actually lose a little bit of money in the new construction taxes. So we go from 237 to 228. So we lose 0.06% revenue, or a little less than $10,000. But all it does is by releasing it, it's lowering our levy rate.
What if we released TIF dollars, but held our dollars collected flat? Without.
We can come up with that number.
I'd like to see that.
What I would tell you is, there's no city doing that. We would be
All right, we might be the only one.
I have a question, and it's just because TIF is always difficult for me to understand. When we do these TIF releases, what does that limit to? How does that affect the city with our future growth? What is the impact?
So tax increment financing, we really need to have debt to collect here. In some cases, our East Central get rates debt that justifies us to collect increment, but it's really debt that's not payable for us until future years. And so we've been collecting, up to this fiscal year, we've been collecting 100% of the increment, because we did have future debt payments we have to. But by only bringing in the dollars we need based on the debt we have, the debt payments we're making in that year, we can actually lower it. So it doesn't really impact the projects that we have debt outstanding. One of the things we did with East Central, working through some improvement programs and PFM, really identified the multi-education project, the public safety building improvements we were looking to do, and improvements at the library, and then identifying what were those cost estimates going to be, and then making sure we had enough increment in the East Central to pay for those projects. And so we've been very careful, and even with the $73 million release that I'm proposing, we are still in a position that we can pay for those projects. So we really watch that to make sure that we're not releasing too much to hamstring us for later projects.
Okay, thank you.
Mike, not to get into the weeds too much on it, but on your immediate prior slide, you talked about that if we were to go to that 2% increase in the general fund, in other words, right there, we would generate $530,000 or $531,000. And you get to that number, now if you go to your next slide.
Sorry.
No,
Way too much animation.
I know, it's great, it makes sense. You're in essence taking, I'm going to call it in the lower table, column 4, if you include projections, yep, that column, correct? It's the property taxes collected minus the property taxes collected in the bottom row of the top table. Is that approximate where you were getting that?
Yes, so it should be 102% of this number.
Okay.
Well, because if you go back, so it says,
And
that
that
it
is,
generates approximately $530,993. Then you go to this slide, where do we find the $530,993 number on this slide?
It's the difference of this number minus that number. And actually, it's going to be the difference, is my recommendation is this table, it's the difference.
Well, we're not worried about, I think we should not be thinking about recommendations at this point.
Yeah.
What we should be thinking about is figuring it out, because I'm a little concerned about that we're jumping to make recommendations before we really know what our options are, and the impact of all those options. So I'm a little concerned that we're talking about recommendations that we don't. I don't know how realistic it is to cut $693,000. It may be, if it is, that's a fundamental element of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
And so I'm not at the recommendation stage. I'm at the look at options.
Yeah.
And that's just me. Others may be at different spot.
And I think more options. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I'm struggling to understand is how the sheet above this works with the sheet below it. So it talks about the 2% will generate approximately $530,993. So where do I find that $530,000?
It's the difference between this number here and that number.
So that presumes, so basically, the fiscal impact is Senate File 2472. For that first bullet point, can you go up again a page? I know it's going to screw up here. So your 530,993 presumes that we have selected
Yes.
this fifth option. Okay.
And obviously it's a gamut. And there's a later slide that I talk about, well, what if we select whole levy's flat. You know, at that point, you know, the gap, obviously the difference is we're going backwards about $500,000. And so our gap then goes from $600,000 gap, to almost a $1.8 million gap.
Right, but that's to me, I think, all the options that we have to understand. What are the realistic options?
Yeah.
Right? And
Absolutely.
what options do we have, and which of them are realistic?
Yeah.
I think that's the part of the process that we have to be willing to undergo without sort of jumping and saying, well, let's follow this path without knowing, you know, could we do X, Y, and Z, you know, more. That's the advantage of starting this discussion early, right? So.
Thank you. I agree. And I think as we go forward, I think one of the things is, I'll talk about that in probably 2 slides. If it's important to keep to target the overall levy rate, I know this year we talked about that. We knew we didn't want to cut the general fund levy rate, because we knew that would have lasting impacts on the city, because that then becomes the base as we go forward. So as we think about that, if we want to keep flexibility for the council, it's moving levy rates. I think what I'm hearing from my peers is, for the general fund, one way or another, they're going to get their levy rate up to 2%, because they want to keep that flexibility in the future. Because this is still part of the legislation that starts to lock you in. That flexibility, if you say, no, it's not palatable to see your overall levy rate grow by 40, 50, 60 cents, or whatever that number is, then you start impacting your other levy rates. You start dialing your employee benefit levy, you start dialing your debt service levies. So you look at where you're going to play with that dial. But from a flexibility standpoint, the general fund is where this legislation impacts. And so cities are targeting to make sure that they can capture that full 2% in the general fund. How they impact the rest of their levies is a different question.
And Mike, I share this with you, I don't want to get into a situation where we are feeling like we have to go to the 102%, add, you know, hit that 2% cap now. Because we're concerned about what's happening in the future, so we're going to get what we can now. Even if we don't need it, we're going to get what we can now. And you know, that's not my approach to budgeting.
And I understand what you're saying.
Come to us with, you know, what you need.
Yeah.
And convince us that, you know, these should be the priorities, these are the things that we should fund, and then we'll figure out how to fund it.
I do want to insert, Mayor, I respect that very much, and I agree. I don't think our policy, my personal policy is similar from the standpoint of not just taking in more for the sake of the next day. But I also heard it stated that we already have some collective bargaining and other negotiations as far as you know, what we have agreed upon as far as above the 2%. And so to some extent, we are locked in on some of those. And so I agree. I think we always need to be very much scrutinizing as good stewards of that budget and that taxpayer money to make sure we're not overspending in other areas. But we do have some commitments that we're already going to have to
I
live up to.
agree, and that's part of the need.
Mike, as you keep going back and forth because of us, and I apologize for that, if you're willing to make an update to this, can you put an asterisk on that 530,993? If nothing else, to jog my memory later on when I look at this, that is inclusive of the TIP release, or slightly modify it so it's the 540, which doesn't include the TIP release, something along those lines. Because I'll wonder once again where those numbers come from. Thank you.
And I can add in the additional option here for us. I'm going to jump one slide because I want to jump into Hyatt. We've been talking about the general fund. And again, this is where the employee benefit really is a component of the general fund. It's just the area of the levy where the legislature has said your costs for health insurance, FICA, Medicare, pension costs can be paid for by uncapped levy that comes out of what's called employee benefits. We do not pay 100% of the costs for those out of the employee benefit. We actually pay a big portion out of our actual general fund, it's really about $2 million. So this is where I had noted where cities will generally are saying, we're gonna capture the 2% in the general fund, but if we're gonna manage the levy rate, this is the levy where we will manage it and, lower or raise it. So for example, we currently have, for FY '27, again, $1.9 billion in taxable value. The employee benefit levy is 87 cents. So our property tax collections are $1.6 million. So, we could lower this and say we're gonna pay more of those costs out of our general fund. Because again, we spend about $2 million more that comes out of our general fund for employee benefits. So we don't even levy half of our employee benefit costs out of the employee benefit levy. And so again, this shows you what the impacts are. Now, we don't have a 2% cap, so we don't care about employee benefit costs out of the employee benefit, or excuse me, extra exemption out of the employee benefit. That was weird. So, again, if we keep a flat levy in the employee benefit, it's 87 cents. And then we lose tax evaluation because of the homestead exemption. So our actual revenues would be $1.6 million, or a decrease of 3.6%. And so this shows, if we go back to, I skipped ahead on debt service, but we'll go back to it. But if we keep a flat levy, if we did increase the general fund and the debt service as an option, our levy rate would increase from 11.38 to 11.79. That's a 41-cent increase in levy rate. Now, if the council said, you have that $600,000 gap, and that's a gap that we think is unacceptable, because we will work through options of what those impacts would need to the budget. We would need to collect $2.3 million out of the employee benefit. And so that would be $1.24 or 38% increase. I'm not recommending that. This is just an example, it's an option. But you would see that the employee benefit would be $1.26. So the overall levy rate to fill that $600,000 gap would require the levy rate to go from 11.38 to 12.17. That's not being recommended, but it's just an illustrated difference between how these different levies can work, and the flexibility and options you have. Again, if you say going from 11.38 to 11.79 is not palatable, this is where this is the employee benefit, is really where you're going to manage that levy rate. I would not recommend you manage it with the general fund levy or the debt service levy. Let's go back to the debt service really quick. So this is the debt service for FY '27, so this is actually what we budgeted. Debt service tax evaluation is higher than our other two because this collects both TIF and non-TIF values. So it's $2.2 billion.
Mike, where you're at in this slide now?
You went backwards.
I went backwards.
One slide.
So I think we're on slide 19 now.
Yeah, that's it there.
So our debt service is $2.2 billion. Our current debt service levy rate is $2.62. So we are projecting for FY '27 to collect $5.9 million. So again, debt service doesn't have new construction, so that variable comes out. So if you wanted to leave the debt service with no levy change, it's $2.62. And so that would raise $5.8 million, or a decrease of 2.08%. And again, it's the homestead exemption that coming out takes $90 million of value out. If you recall, we have approved a 5-year capital improvement plan, and we're going to get in, we did projections for FY '28, we did multi-year projections, we can project out based on that 5-year CIP, how much debt we need to take out each year to to do these and what levy rate needs to be and what that will collect and generate in property taxes. Now, all that work was done before this property tax bill was passed. And so we were projecting with a flat levy of $2.62, that was gonna create or generate $6.2 million in property taxes. Because the world changed with this property tax legislation. And this is what we need to meet our planned debt obligation. We don't take the debt out, we certainly can make changes to the CIP, but our planned debt obligations were $6.2 million. We had a little bit of good news with our bond issuance this last council meeting, so that will have a minor impact, but that will help, but it'll be minuscule in the overall grand scheme of things. So again, when we look at our taxable value, for exemption, our new debt service levy would need to be 281. So that's earlier when we talked about that debt service levy going up to 281. That is why. So unless we want to make changes to the projects that we have planned, one of the big projects is East Long Phase 1 project next year. If we want to push, delay that, or make other capital changes, take projects out. I know next council meeting, I believe we're going to bring a update, or the next public works ad hoc, we're going to talk about payroll, for example. If you decide you want to do a project like that, that certainly can be an impact and change to our overall planned debt issuances. But those are the things that we have to look at because the legislation changed and it changed our overall property values that we have to tax. So this is not a requirement that we continue down this path, but it is one of those constraints that we have to face.
So planned debt obligation includes debt obligations that we've already made.
It has both debt obligations and debt that have already taken out, and then it has planned debt issuances for starting fiscal year 28 and beyond.
So I guess to me, that would be something that I think we should have a conversation about, right?
Yeah.
Okay, these are do they have the CIP plan, and under the CIP plan, these are the new debt that we had planned to do originally. Do we still want, and it's 6 projects or it's 16, do we still want to do all of those? So I would encourage us to set some time aside to have that conversation. I presume you have that in Public Works ad hoc initially or something, or whatever, or finance audit or whatever, but to me, that's something that we should be thinking about having a conversation about.
Mike, I want to make sure that I'm clear then, the figures that you have in my head, those only reflect projects that we have planned to do in FY 2028.
So,
I mean, the existing debt, but also the new projects in FY 2028.
correct.
Nothing beyond that.
It would not include any projects beyond FY 28 per se, but it is planning for, because, I mean, one of the levers you can always pull is when we do our debt issuance in FY 28, you could say, you know what, we're gonna pay less of the debt back, so less of your
Principal and interest.
principal. I was gonna say interest, but I think that was wrong. You could pay less of your principal upfront. Obviously, you pay more interest over time by doing that. But by doing that, you impact your future debt payments and future projects you're gonna do in those future years. So yes and no. It depends on how you pull those levers.
Now, would there also maybe be some debt issuance for property acquisition or utility work for a project that's planned for 29 or 30 that is funded in 28?
I believe so, but I'm gonna look at the experts. So the question was, like a debt issuance we do in 29, we would include property acquisition, utility costs for future projects, so like phase 2 or 3 of Rural A.
Yes, generally it's a 3-year project plan. Year 1 is design and engineering. Year 2, we would include property acquisition costs, utility relocates, such as Mid-American, those folks. and then the third year is construction.
And some of those costs show up in the planned debt obligations.
Yeah, if we were looking at 2030, we would have those utility relocates and property acquisitions in 29. Could have some in 28, but 29 generally.
So I guess to answer that, but I think was your question, there could be some items in 2028 that are kind of the initial first step for something planned for 2029. And that's why we probably got to look at the full list and sort of see what the impact is.
Mike, can I just make sure I understand that the property taxes collected under this debt levy of 5.97 million cover 100% of our debt obligations currently?
It doesn't cover 100% because we also take some of our funds out of
Option.
sales tax. And, we may find, we also pay some of our debt obligations out of our enterprise funds. But the portion that we've identified for all of our capital planning, that would cover 100% of what we plan to cover.
Okay. So
It
I just,
actually only covers probably 99, because we're actually in FY '27, taking a little bit that we have in reserve in that service levy, because that was a decision for that nickel last year. We're taking that out of that service reserve.
okay. So I just want to make sure that we're clear that the 5.971 doesn't entirely meet our debt obligations currently. The projection of 5.8 million, if we were to hold that levy rate steady, still doesn't meet that entire.
No, because we have other funding sources.
So you could, as we talk about options, a potential option would be funding more debt out of local options. Yeah, that's what
I'm trying to figure out how many different feeders come into it.
Right. So that's like also part of the kind of the debt.
Yeah.
Kind of.
And you recall that part of that plan last year was for some of the future out years of the Eastern Hay project, we have planned to spend substantial dollars out of local option sales tax. And so really we're getting back to a point where we're pretty flat overall in our overall expended, our available balance to whittle that down, unless we delay and push some of those phases out.
Mike, I think it's cruel for me to even ask this question, but you don't anticipate them restricting or capping this debt service levy or employee benefit levy, do you?
I'm not a legislator.
Well, just
I would say there certainly was legislation that targeted this. I would say two things I was acutely aware of. Related to debt service, there was a lot of discussion on, do they require all projects to go to vote referendum? That would be a pretty tough bill that we're to go pave a road in Eastern Hay, for example, and say, hey, overall, all Johnston residents, will you pay for that? We'd have to really change our strategy of likely saying, hey, we have a package of projects we're going to do, and they're spread out across the entire city because to get one isolated zone in the city to get a lot of these projects would be a very difficult process. For employee benefit, there was a lot of discussion about applying the 2% cap to the employee benefit also. That was not done. And so there is flexibility there, and certainly you have future legislation that governs that.
the legislation last year always exempted the debt service levy from the 2% cap, but the employee benefit was not exempted from the 2% cap up until the very end. So that the employee benefit one was a real back and forth. And there's some belief that after 718, cities put a lot of money in employee benefits, so that reduces some of the impact. So I think that risk is a little bit still out there on employee benefit, but a little bit less so on debt service.
Thank you.
You talk about then the overall kind of impacts of the employee benefit, and again, this is where I will highlight, these are different options, but, if we keep the employee benefit flat, You can see again, raising that general fund from 788 to 811 assumes we collect full 2% and we're typically keeping the employee benefit levy flat, doing a debt service increase, go from 262 to our plan obligations of 281. So again, we can look at do we delay and cancel certain projects in the overall debt service plan. So that total levy would go from 1138 to 1179, a 40% increase. And again, this was just illustrative, not a suggestion, just giving numbers. But if you want to cover the $690,000 gap we identified earlier, the employee benefit would have to go to $1.24. So you plug that number in the end you can see the levy go from 1138 to 1217. That's a 78% increase. Not, but just want to provide that as an illustration.
I don't understand, if you take the employee benefit levy from 87 cents to $1.24, so that's a 37-cent increase, why doesn't that then reduce the general fund levy by 37 cents?
What we were, again, the general fund levy was at a max of 22%. If you, it's really trying to cover this.
Yeah, so you're not cutting spending by 693,000?
Yes. So it
Yes,
is-
yes, you are cutting spending by 693,000, or no, you're not?
we are, so I mean, I think one of the proposals is, yes, we need to cut overall city expenditures by 693,000. There was a question earlier of, well, what would it take to not, what does that gap represent? And just from an illustrative point, that gap would recommend and require, it's not recommended, staff is not recommending this option. But it would take an increase in the employee benefit, in addition to an increase to the general fund levy, to go from 87 cents to $1.24. So it's just, this is illustrative, this is not a recommendation, right? Just trying to drive the point of what that gap represents.
So if you raise the employee, so basically you're raising the employee benefit level, keeping the general fund levy at $8.11.
Yes.
And not cutting spending.
Correct. Not recommended, but it's just an illustration.
Do you have any sense as to what percentage then of the overall employee benefits would then be covered under the employee benefit levy?
Probably in the, just off the top of the head, about 60%. So, I guess, do you want me to keep going? Do you want me
How
to?
much more time do you need?
I thought,
Yeah, I know. You know how many slides you have left,
I would guess maybe
15 minutes, yeah.
what, 15 minutes?
Let's do it.
One of the things I want to talk about is flexibility. And so this really has to, one of the reasons why we're not recommending changing the employee benefit. We have flexibility in FY, or in May of 23. This slide comes out of our annual credit rating that we do with S&P Global. So we have, in May of 23, we had $3.2 million of flexibility in various levy areas. In May of 25, it actually dropped down to 2.2. As you know, we just did a credit rating with S&P in July, and we're at 2.0. So again, if we did raise that employee benefit up to cover that gap, we would project in FY28 that our flexibility would be down to $1.3 million. And I think that flexibility is really important as we make decisions later. I know any increase in FY 28 in the levy rate is concerning, but I'm going to tell you is our levy rate is going to fall over time. And this next chart kind of shows that.
I'm pretty much, I need to make sure that I understand, what does financial flexibility mean? Does that mean dollars?
Yes,
Right?
it means
Are
dollar.
obligated to anything?
No, it is dollars that the city legally could levy if it had an expense for it in our various levies. So our on-cap levies, so our total liability, our employee benefit, all those on-cap levies, we have we have the ability to legally levy additional dollars in those. Not all cities have flexibility, so I think a lot of the commentary you're saying out of the city of Newman, for example, they're out of financial flexibility. They are maxed out on all their uncapped levies. We're not maxed out, so when you go back to employee benefit, today we are collecting $1.6 million, and we know we have flexibility we have $2 million more.
Because we could increase the levy higher to collect those dollars.
Okay, so, the financial flexibility is what's gonna give the city the ability over time, as that 2%, to consider how do we mitigate, when our costs go up more than what we're gonna receive under that 2% cap. Again, this legislation limits long-term city revenue growth. The financial flexibility will allow us to navigate early years, but I think it's really important, if there's anything in this slide that's important, is once our flexibility is exhausted, difficult decisions become mandatory decisions. Because we obviously can't exceed, our expenses can't exceed our revenues. And so this is a chart that it's really kind of isolated, but it shows some options as we model this, coming out of one of our models. This really says, what if we only had new staff in FY27 that we budgeted for, which we have not had all the staff that we budgeted for. As we work through this, we're being very prudent as we walk through and add new positions. But this assumes we only had the FY27 staff and no new staff as we move into FY20 and beyond. And you can see here, this was showing an increase in our general fund levy. But you can see over time as the 2% plays, this is not a revaluation year. Here becomes a revaluation year. And so you can see it is going to, that 2% cap is going to drive down our levy over time. And this is where then you have flexibility, say you want to offset some of those increases with your employee benefit. This was our early debt service projections, but then you can see the overall levy rate. Over time, our overall levy rate is going to roll down. What's really causing this one-year anomaly in FY28 is again that $90 million release in the homestead exemptions. Once that's released, yes, that's something that continues every year, but its main impact is now baked into our overall valuations for the city, and it becomes less of an issue in those out years. Still has impacts, but the 2% then is what really starts driving levy as we go forward.
The one thing I would suggest, Mike, I think having this conversation is focused a lot on the levy rate.
Yeah.
Without kind of highlighting the fact how the homestead exemption will impact certainly people who own their own home. So that's going to, so even though you're facing a higher levy rate, you're going to be likely, maybe you're getting to that at some point. But if you are, then.
Yep, I have a slide. So there are a lot of different options. I tried to summarize them in the next couple of slides. Again, this is an option of what if we hold levies flat. So then if we keep 1138 at 1138, our overall revenues for the city will go from 22.7 million to 22.1 million. So we'll see a decrease in revenues of $654,000. And again, it's that homestead exemption is why that lowers. If we increase the general fund to capture 2%, cover kind of our planned debt obligations, and we don't do a TIF release, you can see again that general fund rate goes from 1138 to 1212. And so you can see our overall revenues go up to 783,000. And then if we do a TIF release, we could be 1138 overall versus 1179. And our overall revenues would increase 774,000. So there's options. As we continue these discussions, we'll explore these options. I think Again, if we held levies flat, we know we would need to increase, we have to cut expenditures or find revenue increases of about $1.8 million. If we do the allowable growth, do the planned debt obligations, and cut expenditures, our gap would be down to $693,000. So there's a gap we'll have to figure out one way or another. Impact, this is what you were asking, Councilmember Coe. This is based on our approved budget. The average value home in Johnston is $394,700. The rollback this year drops it down to $175,708. The city tax rate's $11.38. So our city tax bill is $2,002. The homestead credit takes $62 off that, so the net tax to the city is $1,940. Then you look at, this is not a revaluation here, so unless you build a new home or you did a major renovation, the property value should remain the same for FY28. So that'd be $394,700 again. We are projecting the rollback will go slightly up. That's what happens in non-revaluation years, so using PFM projections. We're projecting that we collect, or that home will be valued $179,000 for $181. 10% of that on the homestead exemption is $17,942. If we did raise the tax rate to $11.79, the city property tax bill would be $1,906. So it's actually a decrease of $34. So even raising the levy rate 40 cents, the homeowner, residential homeowner, would see a decrease. For non-homestead taxpayers, they would still receive the rollback, but they would receive no benefit of the homestead exemption. So their tax bill in FY27 would be $2,002. And because we do have a higher rate and the rollback is going up, that same homestead, non-homestead property would be $2,118, or an increase of $116, or about 5%. And then a commercial property that is $500,000, after the commercial rollback would be $381,227. Our current tax rate of $11.38. That in city taxes will be $4,348. And again, a homestead would be the assessed value of $500,000 FY28. The rollback does go up slightly again, would be $381,000. The rollback, or excuse me, the tax rate of $11.78. Your city tax bill would be $4,505. So a difference of $158 for approximately 2.5%. Talk about property tax. Any questions at this point? General fund reserves, we highlighted this earlier in the slide, but just to reiterate it, we always plan for a 25% reserve each fiscal year. There's 2 points of time how to look at that. Set the budget and then end of the fiscal year. We ended fiscal year 26 with an ending fund balance of $12.4 million. Our expenditures were $24.8 million. So our maximum reserve would be permitted would be $8.6 million. So this is where we have to look at the end of the fiscal year, what are our projects that we had earmarked these dollars to, didn't expend them in. So we have to obligate those $3.8 million to work through that. So budget work that I think is really important to really talk about. One of the things that staff is going to be working through, again, we are kind of talking about all the revenues and stuff, expenditures and where our gaps are. So staff is working through an exercise. I want to be really clear what this exercise is and is not. We're not beginning with a predetermined list of, well, this is what we're going to cut. We're not facing kind of an immediate crisis with the city. But as this legislation kind of changes our long-term environment, we need to take this opportunity to plan early and kind of work through these challenges and not wait until it's more difficult. I think it's important that we we make some changes now, there is the option of saying, hey, we're gonna raise the levy, which is not being recommended to cover all of the gap. But that is just gonna take the can down the road, and that can be really difficult decisions. But I think it's really important that we take some steps to understand what those are and what are different options, and work with this body, work with the HR Finance Committee through various options and decisions that we have to make. So that's why we're planning now to do this work. Again, FY '27 is $26.3 million in expenditures. Again, we talked the increase about 1.22 will allow growth. We have a gap. We've hit that a few times. Not a crisis, but we do need to make that change. So what are we doing? Departments have been asked to have worked through a planning budget exercise right now, and they're doing that work now as we speak. Departments have been asked to identify options of how to improve the overall general fund position by 1.5%, 2.5%, 5%. That could be a combination of cuts. This could also be a combination of revenue enhancements. So they are to kind of explore those different options and then package them in options that we can present to the HR Finance. So this may be efficiencies, how we make some revenue adjustments, service delivery changes, and then revenue expenditure options, that I said. It should be it shouldn't be just one time, but explore those one time and ongoing. What are the service impacts? What are workforce implications? And then what are different implementation timing of making those changes? Departments have been asked to submit those by September 15th, and we'll work through those and then package those all together. I think principles is really important to preserve those essential high priority city projects or city services that are important to our community, understand the service and community impacts of each of those options. So that would be some of the information that we present. I consider, again, both revenue and expenditure strategies, distinguishing between one-time solutions and ongoing solutions, evaluate workforce and service implications before any recommendations are made, and then we'll incorporate those in discussions with the HR Finance Committee, City Council, and importantly, public feedback. Again, the aim is to maintain long-term financial sustainability. This is the proper tax structure that we'll live through. So the plan is late September, HR Finance Committee will review the option and make some recommendations on what should advance. Early fall, we're still kind of planning this component out. Council will review those proposed reductions and revenue enhancements. We'll then launch kind of a public facing, kind of seek public comments on these various options. And then late fall, City Council will provide direction on strategies to incorporate in the overall budget development. And that's an important timing because in November, December, we start working through the next fiscal year's budget. Departments will revise budgets based on that council direction. And then the finance department will prepare preliminary budgets, and then we'll work through and conduct internal budget reviews as we get ready to bring that forward to the HR Finance in December, and then City Council in January. One thing I'll point out, there's been a lot of publicity around this. I don't know if we go to this extent, but this may be a thing that we look at is how do we get public input in the city of Des Moines. It's kind of doing that campaign right now and actually just wrapping up trying to solicit that. I don't know if this will be the tool we use or if we do more strategic, maybe some listening sessions around the community, but that would be an important component as we look at moving forward on this. So takeaways, I think really important is we do have near-term flexibility. It's really important for us to really think through our budget strategies when we move forward and make some long-term cost control really because of that new valuation and actually the new homestead exemption. New valuation is going to be really important, and new valuation doesn't include just going out and saying we have an annexed area and what we do with projects with our community, bring value, bring a real ROI. So as we look at redevelopment, going out is gonna be just as important as we kind of go up inside our city. And TIF and incentive strategies, we really talk about that at all. But again, in that new construction component, if we do a TIF incentive, that doesn't count as new construction, which then maybe permanently says that can never be new construction, that'll be really important as we look forward. So again, the growth out and up is gonna be really important. TIF is gonna be really important as an economic development tool, but also how we use it is gonna be just as important now going forward. TIF releases, this is actually not my term, it's one of my cohorts turn out there in Metro. It really becomes a math game. And TIF is one of those tools and evaluation release, how we do that release from year to year, is gonna be really important to manage that levy rate. Rollback is always, we still gonna be here, we think that, the old tax system's kind of went away, no one hasn't. So that's gonna be a component we continue to live with. But I think really important is good budgeting, giving the city a lot of flexibility. I think kudos to you, kudos to staff for the work they've done over the years. That flexibility really has positioned us well. There are cities out there that things don't look well. We're hearing that in the Metro, by listening to my colleagues across the state talking about the impacts that this legislation has. We're not in that. So with that, questions? Did I keep the 15? No, I'm sorry.
No. Any quick questions you want? We'll obviously have more questions as we continue what we're going to do with the FY 2020 budget. But Michael, I want to thank you for making this presentation this evening. I think that we still all struggle with what the impact of Senate Bill 2472 will be, and how we're going to make decisions to make sure that we're in compliance with the law, but also doing what we need to do that's best for our residents. So it's a really good thing that we are starting early on this, because we're going to have a lot of good discussion. We're going to have to be creative. I would suggest in our thinking around this, and the goal at the end of the day, of course, is to make sure that we continue to provide the services to our residents that they deserve and that they're paying for. So again, thank you for the presentations. And thanks to all of the staff. We've got a lot of work to do.
Certainly, if there's any
We won't get
questions,
there unless we all work together, so.
certainly if there's any questions, please reach out. Maybe we can say that to the public. We're certainly get together and we're happy to answer questions. So thank you.
Okay, we're going to adjourn the work session. We're going to move